She arrived just after sunrise, a black woman in a gray suit tailored with quiet precision, heels sharp against the marble floor of a building that never expected her to stand at its center. No headlines announced her presence. No red carpet rolled across the polished lobby tiles. Yet by the time the final elevator doors closed months later, her name would be etched into every corridor. Her silence would echo louder than any boardroom decree, and the man who once mocked her in front of his peers would be forced to bow before the very justice he tried to bury. But in that beginning moment, she was invisible by design, mistaken for support staff, smiled at with that cold, polished courtesy reserved for people who aren't meant to matter. What followed wasn't a rise. It was a reckoning, built not on speeches, but on patience sharpened into power. If you're ready for a story where injustice doesn't go unanswered, where the smallest dismissal leads to the firm's greatest unraveling, then you're exactly where you need to be. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from. Your voice belongs here just as much as hers did. The revolving doors whispered shut behind her as Ramona Ellis stepped into the marble lobby of Carrington & Rowe, a towering monument to power, profit, and pedigree. Her heels tapped out a confident rhythm across the polished floor, her suit a muted slate gray with subtle pinstripes, the kind of understated elegance that never tried too hard. Her hair was tied back, edges smooth, and her eyes sharp behind black-framed glasses. She carried no folders, no handbag, just a slim tablet tucked beneath one arm and the certainty of earned place. Years of sacrifice led her here, top of her class at Northwestern Law, 3 major publications on corporate litigation ethics, an internal recommendation from the firm's legal ethics chair. This wasn't a break. It was a rightful arrival. Yet, as she approached the front desk, the receptionist barely looked up before motioning vaguely toward the loading dock. "Deliveries go around the side," she said, eyes still on her screen. Ramona paused. A flicker of surprise broke across her face, but vanished before it fully formed. She adjusted her tone, clarified her name, her role, and her purpose. The receptionist blinked, her smile thinning. "Oh, sorry. Just wait right there. Someone will be down to get you." For 11 minutes, Ramona stood. No one offered her a seat. 2 junior analysts walked past, glancing at her ID badge, then at each other, stifling a laugh. A paralegal brushed by, looked her up and down, and frowned as if trying to recall whether they'd hired new admin staff. Finally, a flustered HR assistant arrived, a young woman named Chelsea, holding a printed packet and muttering apologies. Said there was a system glitch. Said IT hadn't finished the onboarding profile. Said someone should have told her. As they walked toward the elevators, Chelsea's voice grew softer. She explained that Ramona's team lead was caught up in a merger call, so she'd be shown to a temporary desk. Floor 27, Legal Governance and Risk. Ramona said nothing. She watched their reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator wall, noticed how Chelsea avoided eye contact. When the doors opened, the hush on the floor was immediate. Glass offices rimmed the perimeter, the center filled with well-organized desks and polished staff already typing or talking, moving in the practiced chaos of high-stakes law. No one looked up as she passed. Chelsea brought her to a corner desk wedged near the emergency stairwell, said it was just until the partner team finalized seating charts, and handed her a badge that didn't work on the internal server. No drawers. No monitor. The keyboard was unplugged. By 10 o'clock, Ramona had asked 3 separate people for login credentials. One ignored her. One said they weren't sure. One asked if she was shadowing someone from operations. She checked her inbox from her personal phone and found a single welcome email, sent at 8:14 a.m., with no attachments. Around the floor, staff in sleek navy suits huddled in meetings. She saw laughter, shoulders leaned close, a rhythm she hadn't been invited into. She stood and approached a group in Conference Room C, a discussion on third-party litigation risk echoing through the glass. She waited, then gently knocked. The nearest associate looked up, gave a brief nod, and returned to speaking. No one opened the door. At lunch, she visited the firm's ground floor cafe. Others brought back food or had it delivered directly to their office suites. In line, she stood behind a man wearing a rose gold Rolex who turned, looked at her shoes, and gave a smirk so brief it stung more than it surprised. When she reached the register, the cashier glanced at her badge and asked if she qualified for the admin discount. She shook her head once softly. Carrying her salad and sparkling water to the far side of the room, she found a table by the glass, overlooking the plaza fountain. Alone. Around her, others congregated, pods of familiarity and comfort. She was not part of it. No one asked to join her table. No one smiled in her direction. When she returned to her desk, a sticky note had been left on her keyboard. It read simply "wrong floor" in a sharp-angled scrawl. The afternoon brought the executive briefing. She wasn't invited, but her orientation email had included the time and location. She walked in 5 minutes early, choosing a seat near the back. Barrett Langford entered moments later, all polished arrogance and casual entitlement, his shirt open at the collar, watch glinting as he poured himself a glass of still water. When introductions circled the room, he moved quickly, each name clipped with faint approval. Then he reached her, paused, looked down at his notes. "All right, our new intern. Welcome aboard." No one laughed. No one corrected him. Ramona's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She gave a faint nod. She wasn't an intern. She was brought in as legal counsel on special assignment from an international oversight committee. But no one said anything. By 3, the office buzz-quieted. The lights overhead dimmed automatically. She overheard whispers about after-hours drinks. No one asked her to join. Her calendar remained empty. She double-checked it. Nothing scheduled. Her name not added to any thread. Her Slack channel access restricted. She sent a message to IT and received an automated reply. Around her, the rhythm of inclusion moved on without interruption. A man bumped into her chair walking past and didn't look back. A woman placed a catering order for her department and asked everyone's preferences aloud, skipping her entirely. When she finally went to the restroom, she overheard 2 analysts whispering, "The new girl's office isn't even wired yet. Why bother dressing like that? Probably just a rotation temp." It was meticulous work, grounded in precedent and precision. She replied within 10 minutes, confirming she would lead the deck and submit an early draft for review by Tuesday. The reply came 6 hours later. Just a thumbs-up emoji. No name. No thanks. On Tuesday morning, she printed the 32-slide draft, backed by case law analysis, market comparisons, and red flag triggers based on internal metrics. She submitted both the PDF and editable format, attached supporting notes, and followed up with a brief walkthrough video. No one responded. By Wednesday afternoon, she saw the final deck uploaded to the firm's shared drive. Curious, she opened it. Her name was gone. So were her charts, her notes, and her citations. In their place were 9 vague slides titled Litigation Overview, Risk Zones, and Market Reflection. No specifics, just generic bullet points. It looked like a summary written in a rush by someone who had only skimmed her work. Her section had been replaced entirely. At the bottom, the authorship line read, "Prepared by Edward J. Parsons and team." Edward was a second-year analyst who once asked her if Subpoena was a brand of Italian coffee. She stared at the screen for a long moment, jaw tight, hands resting still on the desk. She didn't confront anyone. Not yet. She forwarded the original draft to herself and closed the file. That Friday, she received a formal invite to the firm's leadership retreat, an off-site weekend event for executive training and strategic alignment. The email was sent from Barrett Langford's office. It listed an upscale lodge in Vermont, a schedule of breakout sessions, and an RSVP form that required her department and title. She filled it out as instructed. Legal Counsel Strategic Risk Division. When she arrived at the departure location early Saturday morning, the scene was already humming with eager young professionals wearing branded vests and exchanging stories of past retreats. An assistant handed her a lanyard with a green tag that read, "Operation Support." She paused and asked if it was a mistake. The assistant glanced at the list and replied with a tight-lipped smile, "That's the badge you were assigned." Ramona watched as others clipped on lanyards marked in gold. Leadership Corps. The difference wasn't subtle. Leadership Corps attendees had pre-assigned cabin suites, welcome kits, and priority seating on the chartered buses. Operations Support boarded last, sat in the rear, and were told to wait for room assignments at the lodge front desk. During the opening reception, Barrett raised his glass and toasted to the future leaders of Carrington and Rowe. His eyes passed over the room. They didn't rest on her. The first workshop was divided by badge category. The gold tags entered a private conference hall with leather chairs, touchscreens, and hors d'oeuvres. The green badges were directed to a secondary room with folding tables and a video feed of the primary event. Ramona sat silently, listening to the audio cut in and out, watching the grainy footage of Barrett praising innovative thinking, while behind her, an associate loudly complained about the vegan lunch option. When breakout sessions began, she asked to join the Legal Compliance Strategy Group. A staff coordinator glanced at her badge and shook his head. That group is restricted to Leadership Corps. You're assigned to Logistics and Planning. She spent 2 hours in a circle discussing parking flow for company events. The speaker, a junior manager from Facilities, asked for creative ideas on valet options during peak holiday hours. She stayed quiet. That evening, she sat alone on the lodge's back deck, watching the snow settle in quiet waves across the darkened hills. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the others gathered around the fireplace inside, laughing, sharing stories, sipping wine. Edward Parsons told an animated anecdote that drew applause. She saw Barrett lean in, whisper something to a woman beside him, both laughing as they glanced across the room. Ramona looked down at her untouched glass of cider. Her hands were cold, not from the wind, but from the numbness that settled somewhere deeper than skin. She thought of the long nights she'd spent analyzing firm contracts, the weekends she'd missed family calls to finish briefs, the careful language she used in every email to make sure she came off as assertive but never threatening, capable but never proud. None of it mattered here. Not her credentials, not her record, not even the clarity of her arguments. They didn't see her as a mistake. Worse, they saw her as invisible. The second day of the retreat opened with team-building activities. Ramona's group was assigned snowshoeing, followed by a group challenge. The gold badge teams took part in a negotiation simulation inside a heated conference dome. Her team trekked through slush, losing time and direction because the guide only offered vague instructions. When they returned, soaked and stiff, the gold group had moved on to a catered lunch in a private room. Hers was given boxed sandwiches. She asked someone what time the debrief would be. The reply was a shrug. Not sure your group's part of that. Back at the office on Monday, no one asked about her weekend. Her name wasn't listed in the summary email recapping the event. Barrett's thank you note at the bottom mentioned the success of the Leadership Corps gathering and how this new generation would define the future of the firm. Her inbox held no follow-up, no feedback on her retreat session notes, no invites to the debrief calls. That afternoon, she overheard Edward joking near the espresso machine, said something about the retreat's support crew looking like an HR experiment gone wrong. A few others laughed. One mimicked someone's voice. Another said they felt safer with the gold tags in the room. Ramona didn't move. She didn't look over, but her pen dug slightly deeper into the legal pad resting under her palm. This time, though, the receptionist didn't ignore her. She offered a sudden, saccharine smile and informed Ramona that all staff had been asked to check in with the executive office upon arrival. No explanation, just direction. Ramona nodded once, adjusted the strap on her laptop bag, and took the elevator to the 36th floor, a floor she had never been invited to before. The carpet was thicker, the lights warmer, and the art more curated. She passed two men in dark suits who gave her the kind of glance that bordered on evaluation and dismissal in the same second. She reached the suite and knocked gently before entering. A senior administrator waved her in without looking up. In the corner, Barrett Langford leaned against the edge of a glass desk, flipping through a folder as if killing time. Without looking up, he welcomed her in a tone that was far too casual, too practiced. When he finally did lift his eyes, they moved across her face, down to her shoes, then lingered on her hair. It had been a humid morning, and Ramona's curls had gathered at the edges, creating soft, natural volume. She had clipped the front back neatly, leaving the rest free but orderly. Barrett set the folder down, then crossed his arms, tilting his head with a look that tried to pass for thoughtful concern. He spoke about the firm's image, how appearances translated into client confidence, and how they were implementing new guidelines for professional presentation. He never said her name directly. He didn't have to. He referenced consistency, polish, brand alignment. Then he paused and said some people had styles that were beautiful but distracting. He smiled, a hollow grin that rang of dominance, not kindness. He said something about grooming alignment. Ramona didn't speak. She nodded once. He dismissed her with a gesture toward the door, as if he had solved something. Back at her desk, she stared at the screen without seeing it. She opened an internal memo about the upcoming investor photo shoot scheduled for Thursday. A mandatory event, full firm participation expected. Attached was a wardrobe directive. Formal business attire, preferably in navy, charcoal, or muted tones. She made a note to pull her navy suit out for dry cleaning. That evening, she washed and carefully braided her hair overnight, planning to wear it tucked in a low bun beneath a silk wrap until morning to ensure it held perfectly. On Thursday, she arrived at the studio level prepared. Others milled around in well-fitted suits and crisp blouses. Photographers adjusted lights and clicked through test shots. Ramona approached the wardrobe station as instructed and presented her name. The assistant glanced at a clipboard, then reached for a bag labeled with her name. Inside was a jacket and blouse in company green. The color was jarring, a harsh, synthetic shade somewhere between avocado and neon moss. It looked nothing like the sophisticated palettes around her. She asked if there had been a mistake. The assistant said it came from the executive office and had been selected to highlight team diversity. The words were said so quickly and so mechanically that Ramona knew the answer was final. She changed into the jacket, adjusted the collar, and stepped out into a room full of peers in deep navy and slate gray. She stood out like a traffic cone in a boardroom. When it was her turn for photos, the lead photographer asked her to smile more, then less, then tilt her chin up, then down. She posed while others watched. Behind her, Barrett arrived midway through the shoot and stood off camera, arms folded, surveying the session. He made a quiet comment to the marketing head, who laughed. Ramona's face tightened. She finished the shoot and moved quickly back to the dressing room to change. Her phone buzzed with an email alert, a reminder from HR that she had a midday meeting about professional presentation standards the following week. No detail, just an appointment and a location. Later that afternoon, the communications team sent around a preview gallery from the shoot. Ramona clicked through it, slide by slide. Team members standing in well-coordinated groups, shoulder to shoulder, confident and poised. She appeared on the fourth row, center column. Her face calm, posture perfect, but the green jacket made her look like she didn't belong, like she had wandered onto the wrong set. The lighting on her image was oddly harsh. The caption beneath her name was incorrect. It read, Executive Administrative Services. She stared at it for a full 30 seconds. Then she sent a quiet note to the communications team with the correction. An hour later, they replied that the file had already been finalized and sent for printing in the Q3 investor booklet. They would update it in the digital version, maybe. The rest of the day blurred. In a status meeting for a litigation forecast, her input was brushed aside with a vague comment about keeping the legal perspective simple for clarity. Edward Parsons once again offered a summary based on her notes. No one objected. When she walked past the break room, she heard two associates arguing about a marketing headline. One asked if it sounded too urban. The other said they didn't want to get flagged by DEI. Ramona's name floated in the sentence, then vanished. No one lowered their voices. That evening, she stayed late, not to finish a brief or polish a memo. She stayed to avoid the goodbye stares. She stayed because the silence in the office after hours was less suffocating than the noise during the day. At her desk, she opened a blank document and began to write. Not a memo, not a proposal, just notes. She listed the date of her arrival, the first mistaken identity, the retreat badge, the wardrobe directive, the caption error. Her hands didn't shake. They moved steadily, recording what her voice could not yet say. No direct request, no assignment, just a single sentence noting her as a support contact for documentation oversight. She reviewed the agenda, which detailed topics she'd written briefs on just weeks earlier. Risk management structuring, ethics compliance benchmarking, policy shifts for multi-state litigation coverage. Every topic aligned with her expertise. Yet the tone of the email told her she would not be speaking. She would be present but not heard, included but not acknowledged. On the morning of the summit, Ramona arrived 30 minutes early. She wore her charcoal gray suit, conservative and precise, paired with a pale blue blouse. Her hair was neatly pressed and tucked into a smooth chignon. She walked with the calm dignity of someone who had learned long ago to protect her pride in hostile spaces. The executive conference suite had been transformed. Tall glass windows now covered in privacy film. Every chair wrapped with new upholstery, and the long mahogany table glistening under soft lighting. Nameplates had been arranged along the length of the table, each paired with bottled water and a leather folder embossed with the firm's seal. As she walked toward her assigned seat, Ramona paused. Her nameplate was half hidden, tucked behind a stack of white catering boxes at the far end of the table. It didn't match the others, where most were printed in block serif font with clean engraving. Hers was written on a folded 10 card, Ellis Art, in faded ink, positioned next to an empty plastic cup and a notepad missing half its pages. She didn't touch the boxes. She didn't move the nameplate. She sat down, opened her folder, and found it empty. No briefing materials. No notes. No annotated agenda. The others filed in gradually. Barrett entered last, flanked by 3 regional partners and 2 corporate finance leads. Everyone greeted each other with handshakes and shoulder claps. Ramona received a single glance from a junior partner she didn't recognize, followed by a polite nod that dissolved into disinterest before it fully formed. As the summit began, Barrett took the head seat and welcomed the room with a practiced ease, his voice confident, measured, theatrical. He made a few light jokes to ease the tension, then pivoted into the firm's performance. Charts appeared on the mounted display. Financials, revenue targets, market capture statistics. Ramona followed along silently, noting several errors in the data alignment she had previously flagged, but that had been ignored. Then Barrett turned slightly, gesturing in her direction. He didn't say her name. He didn't explain her role. Instead, he asked if someone could grab fresh coffee for the group and maybe top off the water pitchers. A beat passed. All eyes remained on him. His gaze lingered just a little too long in her direction. No one else moved. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Without speaking, Ramona rose, crossed the side table, and filled 2 carafes with coffee, then began refilling glasses one by one. As she did, the conversation resumed as if nothing unusual had occurred. Discussion shifted to litigation exposure in the Northeast sector. A regional partner referenced a new interpretation of state privacy laws. Ramona recognized the argument. It was hers, lifted nearly verbatim from a memo she'd written 2 weeks earlier. Her name had not been attached to the document, and now it flowed from someone else's mouth as if conjured from original thought. When she returned to her seat, she found that her notepad had been used. Someone had drawn a diagram on the last clean page, a rough sketch of a balance sheet paired with arrows and illegible notes. She said nothing. She pulled a spare from her bag and began taking notes in silence. 30 minutes later, as the meeting moved into policy review, Barrett again gestured toward her, this time asking her to record key action items and circulate them by end of day. Not to the group, but only to executive leadership. He said it in a tone that made it sound like a favor, like a small task not worth burdening the others with. No one objected. No one offered to help. As she typed, Ramona caught glimpses of side conversations. Jokes, shared texts, glances passed beneath lowered lashes. Her presence wasn't invisible. It was simply miscast. The catered lunch arrived late. The delivery staff entered through the side, wheeling trays of salmon and roasted vegetables, followed by a dessert cart stocked with espresso and petit fours. Barrett stood and declared a short break. As the room buzzed with movement, he turned to Ramona and asked if she could help the catering team coordinate setup, just to keep things smooth. Again, no name. Again, no direct request. Just the performance of inclusion in the tone of instruction. She nodded. She spent the next 20 minutes arranging platters, adjusting name tags, and pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses while her peers took their seats and resumed small talk about vacation plans and property investments. One associate leaned over to another and whispered something behind a hand, both glancing briefly in her direction before laughing under their breath. As the summit wrapped, Barrett gave closing remarks filled with platitudes about unity, strategy, and the power of leadership. He thanked the group for their insight, their energy, their commitment to excellence. He thanked Edward Parsons by name for his contributions to the litigation review. He thanked Caitlin from HR for her organizational support. He did not mention Ramona, not once. As the attendees began to leave, one of the partners accidentally knocked over a stack of folders near Ramona's seat. Papers scattered across the floor. He chuckled, said he'd had too much coffee, and walked away. She knelt to gather them. No one helped. Later that day, Ramona received a follow-up email from Barrett's assistant thanking her for her help during the summit. It referred to her contributions as invaluable support services. The wording was deliberate. The subject line read, "Thanks for your coordination." No acknowledgement of her expertise. No feedback on her documentation. No invitation to the post-summit analysis session. Ramona read the message once, then deleted it. She saved a copy of the summit transcript. She copied her own notes and filed them in a private folder titled Documentation Q2. She then opened the original policy memo she had written, the one that had been paraphrased without credit, and added a version control tag to it, marking it with her initials and date of authorship. It wasn't protest. It wasn't confrontation. But it was preservation, a quiet claim of authorship in a space that had tried again and again to reduce her to a function rather than a force. The shared drives were inaccessible, locked behind a red warning that read permission denied. Her email inbox still functioned internally, but any attempt to send or receive messages from external contacts resulted in an automatic bounce back marked restricted address. Confused, she refreshed her permissions through the firm's access management system, but nothing changed. She reached out to IT and was told, without detail, that her credentials were under review for routine maintenance. The words were spoken like a well-rehearsed excuse, and the support ticket was marked low priority. This might have gone unnoticed in a different week, but Ramona had been assigned as the legal point of contact for the upcoming investor risk report due that Wednesday. She had spent days coordinating with two outside consultants, one in cybersecurity law and the other in offshore liability compliance. Their insights were critical for the language used in the finalized report, and she needed to incorporate last-minute data revisions into the final draft. Without external access, she couldn't receive their updates. She couldn't verify documentation or respond to final inquiries. She documented every step of the issue, noting timestamps, sending internal alerts, and even walking to IT twice to escalate the matter. No urgency was returned. The final report was due by 3 p.m. Wednesday. At 2:18 p.m., the internal project manager entered her workspace and asked whether she had sent the completed version to the investor relations team. Ramona explained the access issue. She showed him the error messages, the IT ticket, and the printout of the original report with her handwritten updates. He nodded, said he would look into it, and left without further comment. At 5:45 p.m., an email went out to the partner distribution list from the CFO, noting the delay in the investor report's delivery and citing a breakdown in the legal compliance checkpoint. Ramona's name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. She was the only legal checkpoint in the chain. The implications settled like fog over her reputation. No one reached out to ask for clarification. No one asked whether she had been locked out. The silence wasn't passive. It was accusatory. That same evening, she received a calendar invite titled Workspace Adjustment, scheduled for Thursday morning with Human Resources. The meeting was held on the 12th floor, a level she had only visited once for onboarding. The HR coordinator, a young man named Blake, greeted her with a clipboard and a rigid smile. He explained that the firm was optimizing workspace efficiency across departments and that her role had been identified as mobile compliant, meaning she could perform her work without requiring proximity to any core team members. She was being reassigned to Office 12B, which, he explained, was a flexible zone near infrastructure support. When she arrived at the space, she saw immediately what infrastructure support meant. Her new office was a repurposed supply room next to the server closet. There was no window. The air was dry and smelled faintly of static electricity. The walls were scuffed, and the overhead light flickered when powered on. The desk was half the size of her previous one, and the chair still had torn packaging around its base. A single filing cabinet stood against the wall with no lock. She stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute, unsure whether to laugh or scream. Instead, she stepped inside, placed her bag on the desk, and sat down. Her badge failed to open the server closet next door, but she could hear the cooling fans through the wall, humming like a distant engine that never stopped. She sent a message to Blake asking for clarification about the move. He replied 2 hours later, stating again that the relocation was based on a firm-wide audit and not performance-based. Over the next 2 days, no one visited her. Her emails, though polite and precise, were slow to be answered or completely ignored. Meeting invites that had once arrived without fail stopped populating her calendar. A senior associate asked in passing whether she had transferred departments. Someone else asked if she was now part of the operations unit. She was becoming invisible by design. When she attempted to schedule a compliance review with the marketing team, a routine legal function, she was told they had already consulted with Barrett's external counsel. When she followed up on the matter of her access being revoked earlier that week, she was informed the issue had been resolved, though no one admitted to placing the block in the first place. She filed a formal inquiry. It went unacknowledged. On Friday afternoon, while walking to the break room, she passed a glass conference room where Barrett stood briefing the strategy team. As she walked by, he didn't pause. He didn't look up. But someone near him glanced at her through the glass and nudged the person next to them. Both laughed. She didn't look back. She returned to Office 12B and resumed reviewing a liability document with the door closed. The walls were too thin to provide true privacy. She could hear the IT manager next door discussing toner cartridges with a vendor. The fan noise rose and fell like breath. Ramona started documenting everything again. She logged the email issue with timestamps. She listed the failed external connections. She made copies of the access error messages and saved them on a USB drive. She recorded her request for clarity from HR and attached Blake's response. She annotated the CFO's report email with metadata and tracked her original submission time compared to the delayed delivery. She was collecting not just evidence, but truth, each file a nail, each timestamp a plank, constructing a silent scaffold of reality in a workplace that specialized in rewriting narratives against her. She had grown used to the hollow stillness that filled her windowless workspace, the mechanical breathing of the server fans, and the deliberate absence of her name from calendars, memos, and meetings where her expertise should have been not only acknowledged but required. Despite the invisibility she was made to endure, her work did not diminish in value. In fact, it expanded. Compliance documents continued to arrive in her inbox, most uncredited, some clearly drawn from her previously submitted memos, others arriving with generic requests that matched content she alone had authored. Yet no one spoke her name in connection to them. She had become a ghost, an unseen hand whose influence was appropriated without recognition. That atmosphere deepened one Wednesday morning when a group of out-of-state partners visited the firm for a full-day strategic tour and internal evaluation. The event was structured by Barrett's office to showcase leadership, efficiency, and innovation across departments. Ramona had received no formal invitation to participate, though she had been instrumental in crafting the firm's cross-departmental ethics audit proposal, which had led to many of the new risk mitigation protocols that would be highlighted during the visit. Still, when she arrived at her floor, there was no mention of her involvement. Curious, she quietly made her way upstairs to observe. From a distance, she watched as Barrett led the group through the executive suites, stopping at each department head's desk or office, praising their contributions, highlighting team leads, showcasing statistical improvements, and offering insights into firm direction. When they reached the governance department, the one Ramona had supported with almost every policy revision in the last 3 months, Barrett introduced a junior analyst who had only joined weeks earlier as the key contributor to their process realignment. He used phrases like rising star and forward thinker, while never acknowledging the source of the documentation or the foundational research that had enabled those realignments in the first place. Ramona stood still, just far enough from the tour to remain out of focus, yet close enough to hear every word. At one point, a visiting partner noticed her standing near a whiteboard covered in oversight matrices and asked a question about the firm's audit preparation. Barrett turned, looked past her as though she weren't there, and responded with a general statement about how the leadership team handled all compliance reviews in-house. He then gestured toward Edward Parsons, who smiled sheepishly and added something vague about real-time data tracking. The group nodded. They moved on. She returned to her desk in silence, placed her phone face down, and opened her laptop. The notes she had prepared for the tour, notes she had never been asked for, remained untouched in her drafts folder. She didn't delete them. She simply changed the document name to Internal Misrepresentation, Tour Protocol V1. 2 days later, a mass firm-wide email announced an upcoming charity gala. Hosted by Carrington and Rowe at a historic art museum uptown, the gala was an annual tradition meant to foster corporate goodwill, celebrate philanthropic partnerships, and, more transparently, build favor with affluent clients. All senior staff were expected to attend, and executive leadership would be involved in planning and execution. Ramona received her invitation late, forwarded by someone from HR who attached a brief note stating that she had been requested by Barrett's office to assist with on-site logistics coordination during the event. She replied seeking clarification. The response came quickly, vague in tone, citing her strong organizational skills, and stating that her badge and responsibilities would be available at the registration desk upon arrival. On the evening of the gala, she arrived in a formal black dress, simple and elegant, accompanied by a blazer to suit the business formal tone of the gathering. The museum's grand foyer had been transformed into a glittering space of light and sound, marble columns bathed in warm gold hues, and live jazz echoing through the halls. Tables were lined with curated dishes and sparkling glassware. Name cards displayed corporate titles. Ramona approached the check-in station and gave her name. The woman behind the table scanned the list, then handed her a lanyard marked event staff in block letters, with no name, no role, no firm designation. She asked if there had been a mistake. The woman, flustered, checked again, then showed her a list where Ramona's name was printed beside a title that read Hospitality Coordinator. For a moment, she stood there holding the lanyard, staring at the label as if trying to see through it. Then she placed it around her neck and walked into the hall. Inside, executives mingled with donors and clients, champagne flowed freely, and Barrett himself stood near the gallery entrance, shaking hands and telling stories with animated gestures. Ramona kept to the perimeter as instructed. Throughout the night, she was asked by several attendees where to find the restrooms, how long the speeches would last, whether valet parking would remain available after midnight. Someone mistook her for catering. Another handed her an empty glass with a smile that carried no recognition. She played the role assigned to her, moving between stations, ensuring that the run of show remained on schedule. When Barrett approached the podium to give his speech, he paused at the end to thank the staff for making the evening possible. He listed several names, none of them hers, and concluded with a sweeping nod to our support team who worked behind the scenes. The audience applauded. As the music resumed and the evening wore on, Ramona stepped outside for air. The cold night wrapped around her like a bomb. She stood alone near the museum's colonnade, looking out at the city. Inside, the noise of celebration felt distant, like another world she had once imagined herself part of, but now recognized as fiction. She pulled her blazer tighter and breathed deep. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were clear. She turned back to the building not because she had to, but because there was still something left to witness. Back inside, she collected the remaining copies of the event itinerary, removed the unused materials from the registration table, and thanked the venue coordinator. Then she returned to her apartment and placed the lanyard on her desk. She stared at it in the same way she had stared at her misplaced nameplate, her isolated office, her deleted email access. Each item told the same story in different forms: who they thought she was and who they refused to see. Her memos were mirrored and archived. Each file she touched bore a coded watermark that only she could trace. She said little, but behind her eyes, the calculus of consequence was alive. That Tuesday morning, she received a confidential forward from a former professor who now worked with an international legal ethics committee. The message was short and pointed. There would be an unannounced audit of Carrington and Rowe's internal compliance practices within the week. Ramona's breath slowed as she reread the message. She closed the email and leaned back in her chair. Office 12B buzzed quietly around her, the fans humming against the silence. She looked at her laptop, opened her private folder, and began reviewing the documents that had long been dismissed within the firm but had never lost their weight. On Thursday afternoon, a high-level board discussion was convened in the main conference suite. Ramona had not been invited, but that was expected. The conversation centered on an ongoing regulatory review involving international partner firms. It was a topic Ramona had flagged over a month ago, her recommendations buried in a memo that had been ignored and later referenced without her name in a summary Barrett had presented to stakeholders. Now, the issue had returned under fire, and it was clear from the tension in the room that the board was no longer satisfied with superficial solutions. As she passed the suite on her way to deliver a requested brief to legal operations, she heard her memo being discussed aloud, nearly word for word, including a line she had written verbatim about third-party disclosure risks under amended regional statutes. A partner unfamiliar to her raised a question, challenging the logic behind the summary presented by Barrett. He asked for the source. The room fell quiet. Barrett hesitated, then deflected, saying it was the product of a joint compliance review. The partner, unconvinced, turned toward the door as Ramona stood just outside. His eyes met hers through the glass. "You," he said. "You wrote this, didn't you?" Ramona didn't blink. She opened the door, stepped inside, and nodded once. Yes. The room remained silent. She walked to the boardroom table and rested the brief she carried in front of Barrett without breaking eye contact. She then turned toward the partner who had spoken. "That paragraph is mine. The case citations are mine. The risk analysis is mine. The original report was submitted on March 6th, appended with a digital signature. I can provide the full version if requested." Her voice was calm, even, without arrogance or apology. It was not a plea for validation. It was a confirmation of truth. The partner leaned back slightly, visibly processing the revelation. Barrett smiled, thinly, attempting to shift the mood. He dismissed the moment with a casual tone, suggesting that oversight sometimes led to blurred credit lines. Ramona said nothing more. She turned, exited the room, and returned to her office. But the silence she left behind echoed longer than any words might have. The next day began quietly. But just after 11, a notice went out that a surprise ethics compliance review would begin immediately. A representative from the International Legal Governance Council had arrived on site, requesting access to all firm-wide compliance documentation, review trails, and ethics advisory communications. Panic rippled through the upper levels. Barrett's assistant scrambled through archives. Partners made calls to locate files that had long been buried in administrative corners. Ramona remained seated in office 12B until her internal line rang. It was the executive reception desk. The auditor had asked for her by name. She rose, adjusted her suit, and made her way to the 36th floor where the atmosphere had turned electric with unease. She entered the glass conference room and found the auditor seated calmly at the head of the table. A woman named Evelyn Spence, known across the legal sector for her precision and incorruptibility. Evelyn stood and extended her hand. "Ramona, it's good to finally meet in person." Barrett, who stood near the door with folded arms, froze for a second. Evelyn continued, addressing the room with the clarity of someone who expected obedience. "Ms. Ellis is our appointed senior oversight counsel for this review. She will assist in verifying internal consistency and record authenticity." The silence that followed was not just shock, it was a dismantling of assumptions. Barrett stepped forward, attempting to regain control. He spoke about hierarchy, about process, about roles. Evelyn cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm aware of your internal structure. This appointment was made external to your firm under Clause 17 of the Ethics Oversight Charter, which authorizes independent evaluators without prior internal disclosure." Ramona did not smile. She didn't need to. She simply stepped beside Evelyn, opened her folder, and placed a copy of her signed appointment letter on the table. She then laid out her analysis checklist, the documentation trail she had kept, the timestamp files, and her conflict of interest declarations. Barrett's face drained of its usual confidence. Others in the room exchanged glances, some suddenly remembering her name with newfound clarity. The rest of the day moved like a controlled burn. Files were reviewed, meeting transcripts were pulled, email chains were traced back to original sources. Ramona moved through each task with quiet, methodical precision, never speaking more than necessary, never raising her voice. Evelyn deferred to her for verification multiple times, and each time, Ramona answered without hesitation. At one point, a partner privately apologized for having not recognized her role sooner. She thanked him, then asked for the timestamp on his latest compliance declaration. By the end of the day, Evelyn concluded the first stage of the audit. She confirmed that further inquiries would follow, and that some internal practices raised concerns regarding attribution, communication transparency, and personnel treatment under Title IX equity standards. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Barrett remained in his office more than usual, meeting behind closed doors with the Internal Risk Committee and whispering instructions to assistants who no longer carried the same sense of urgency in their step. Ramona, on the other hand, continued her work with the calm discipline that had always defined her, but now her presence drew attention wherever she walked, not from novelty, but from consequence. Midweek, a firm-wide meeting was scheduled under short notice. The subject line read, "Mandatory Organizational Briefing Compliance Transition Initiative." The entire firm was summoned to the Grand Forum space on the 18th floor, an auditorium-style hall, reserved only for quarterly shareholder updates or high-profile legal briefings. Ramona arrived 5 minutes early and sat in the center aisle without fanfare. She carried no notepad, no files. She didn't need to. Her expression was composed, her posture straight, her hands folded lightly in her lap. The seats around her gradually filled, partners and associates alike stealing occasional glances her way, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and poorly masked anxiety. At precisely 10 o'clock, the stage lights dimmed slightly and Evelyn Spence stepped forward to the podium. She greeted the firm, her voice cool and deliberate, and proceeded to outline the results of the initial audit. Her tone was not aggressive, but firm, citing procedural inconsistencies, breakdowns in internal communication, and patterns of contributor attribution failure. She paused before announcing the firm's response plan, the establishment of a standing internal oversight and ethics review committee, a structural body that would not only audit compliance policies, but also oversee cultural and behavioral standards across the firm. Then came the name. Effective immediately, the committee will be chaired by Ramona Ellis, appointed by external governance authority under Section 4B of the Ethics Charter. The room froze. Audible surprise rippled through the rows. Murmurs stirred like wind through dry leaves. Evelyn continued without pause. "Ms. Ellis will assume leadership effective today. With full access to firm records, operational authority over transitional compliance reporting, and direct accountability only to the Oversight Board. There were no questions allowed, no interruptions invited. She turned toward Ramona and nodded. Ramona stood and made her way to the stage with the same quiet confidence she had carried in every unnoticed walk through the firm's halls. Now every step was seen. She took her place beside Evelyn and addressed the room. Her voice was clear, unshaken. She began not with retaliation, but with purpose, outlining the goals of the new committee, its commitment to transparency, its respect for fairness, and its role not as punishment, but as preservation of truth, of trust, and of equity. She spoke of accountability without vengeance, of justice without humiliation. Her words were surgical, deliberate, and impossible to twist. At the close of her address, Evelyn stepped forward once more. She announced that, during the compliance transition phase, direct reporting for operational matters would be adjusted. Effective immediately, the CEO's compliance interactions would route through the new committee chair. That meant Barrett Langford would now report to Ramona Ellis on all governance-related procedures until further notice. The room did not gasp. It exhaled. A long, silent reckoning filled the space. Barrett, seated in the front row, blinked slowly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. His face, normally so composed, twitched in a barely perceptible tick at the corner of his mouth. Ramona looked directly at him, not with satisfaction or superiority, but with the same calm gaze she had worn when handing him coffee weeks before. Now the position between them had reversed, not through a speech, not through vengeance, but through competence, precision, and undeniable fact. The meeting concluded. No applause, just a weighty silence as people stood and exited the room, glancing at Ramona as they passed. Some nodded with genuine respect. Others looked away quickly, unsure of what was now required of them. Barrett remained seated for a moment, then rose and left the stage area through a side door without a word. That afternoon, Ramona received her updated access credentials. Her clearance surpassed even the previous tier of executive review. She was granted entry to the archival floors, direct authorization over personnel review protocols, and the right to call independent sessions with any department for performance inquiry. She did not use her access frivolously. She scheduled no immediate meetings. She sent no pointed memos. She simply reviewed the documentation that had once been withheld from her. She opened the gates that had once been closed, but she did not announce her presence loudly. She simply began to govern. That week, several department heads sent her quiet emails requesting meetings. Some offered apologies thinly veiled in administrative language. Others asked for guidance or clarification. She responded evenly to all, offering scheduled times without commentary, logging each request, and assigning action items accordingly. She established a digital dashboard that tracked oversight progress and shared it openly with department leads. The metrics were clear, the feedback anonymous, the benchmarks public. It was a kind of clarity the firm had long claimed to value but never enacted. Now, under Ramona's leadership, transparency was no longer an aspiration. It was a policy. On Thursday, Barrett sent a request for a 30-minute meeting. Ramona accepted without reply. He arrived at her new office, no longer the closet next to the server room, but a repurposed conference suite converted for her role. He stepped in, not with the arrogance he had once worn like a second skin, but with the hesitancy of someone unsure how to stand in a room where their assumed superiority no longer held shape. He sat across from her and began to speak, but she raised a hand gently, stopping him. "This is a governance review meeting. We will remain on agenda." She opened the file before her and began the session. That meeting was not dramatic. It was not emotional, but it was defining. Every misattribution, every obstruction of process, every misalignment of responsibility was addressed. Not with accusations, but with records. Barrett offered explanations. Some were shallow, others rehearsed. Ramona responded only with data. At the close of the meeting, she handed him a copy of the compliance restructuring plan and requested his implementation report by the following Monday. She stood, He followed suit. There was no handshake, no bitterness, just the quiet recognition of a changed structure. Ramona initiated the first full-cycle audit the firm had ever undergone internally, not to punish, but to understand where the systems had failed, where voices had been silenced, and where power had operated unchecked. Her approach remained unemotional, professional, and relentless. She didn't seek confrontation. She sought clarity. But as the audit gained momentum, it revealed far more than even she anticipated. The initial findings were structural: gaps in documentation, inconsistencies in feedback reports, redundant budget lines. But when the audit reached the discretionary fund allocations, everything began to unravel. Buried within the financial ledgers of executive operations, Ramona and her team uncovered a pattern. Over the course of 2 fiscal years, significant funds from the discretionary partnership pool had been redirected not toward innovation, training, or retention, but to cover losses and operational expenses in underperforming departments that were led by Barrett's closest allies. These reallocations had not gone through proper review. There were no co-signatures from the finance oversight team, and the digital approval records had been obscured using layered permission tagging that was never standard practice. When Ramona traced the approvals, the pattern pointed to Barrett's executive code used outside its scheduled login windows, suggesting that access had been manipulated or passed down, a violation of internal security protocol. The numbers alone were damaging, but it was the intent they revealed that destabilized the last illusion of Barrett's untouchable leadership. These funds, meant for growth and stability, had instead been funneled toward protecting individuals with documented performance concerns. Several of the individuals had been the same voices who laughed in Ramona's direction during meetings, who posted empty praise about the firm's commitment to inclusion on public forums while privately undermining efforts for reform. Now their success had a price tag, and it had been charged directly against the integrity of the institution. Ramona didn't go public immediately. She submitted her report to the executive board with annotations, full audit trails, and a request for a closed session meeting. The board convened on a Thursday morning. Barrett entered the meeting unaware of the full scope. He expected resistance, perhaps a policy disagreement, something he could reframe as procedural. What he faced instead was an assembled committee, seated in silence, as Ramona opened the session with a projection of the financial report. She did not accuse. She presented. Every figure, every transfer, every policy breach was displayed with corresponding documentation. She read each line with precise neutrality, her tone never rising, her face composed. When the full scope of the redirection was laid bare, one board member asked Barrett if he wished to respond. He began a monologue about strategy, about long-term vision, about keeping departments afloat during market fluctuations. Ramona waited until he finished, then displayed the internal emails, his messages to senior allies discussing optics, covering losses to protect reputation, using discretionary funds as leverage for political favors. The room fell into a silence that even Barrett's practice charm could not penetrate. A vote was called. It was unanimous. The board, which once clung to Barrett as a symbol of firm stability, now saw him as a liability. They requested his resignation, effective immediately, with an agreement to forfeit all future compensation under breach of fiduciary trust. Barrett's face, once the face of the firm, showed no rage, no denial, only a kind of stunned detachment, as though he had always believed himself immune to consequence, and only now realized that power unaccountable was not permanent. Ramona conducted the final meeting herself. It was held in the same boardroom where she had once poured coffee and been asked to take notes. Now she sat at the head of the table, across from Barrett, with 2 committee witnesses present and a recorder set for transparency. She reviewed the terms, read the compliance summary aloud, and confirmed each point of the resignation agreement. Barrett signed in silence. When the documents were complete, Ramona slid the pen toward him and spoke the only words that weren't procedural that day. "This meeting is concluded." Barrett stood. He looked at her, perhaps searching for some trace of vindictiveness, some smirk, some verbal victory. He found none. Her gaze held steady, her posture unbroken. She didn't look away. He exited the room not as a leader, but as a memory. News of his resignation spread by afternoon. An internal communication was released to all departments, citing the decision as part of a strategic ethics realignment. His allies, now exposed by their dependence on protected funding, either resigned voluntarily or were placed under review. No press statement was released, no social media parade was posted. The silence itself was a message. Carrington and Rowe had been altered, not with fanfare, but with fact. In the days that followed, Ramona met with department heads, now hesitant but cooperative, to rebuild oversight frameworks. She requested independent consultants review the systems she was redesigning to ensure impartiality. Her approach earned not just respect, but stability. The firm did not collapse. It recalibrated, and through it all, Ramona never raised her voice. She never demanded apology or revenge. She worked methodically, carefully, transparently. The server room outside her former office was eventually converted into a compliance data center. Her old nameplate, LSR. Was never replaced. She kept it in a drawer, a reminder not of where she had started, but of how much she had endured. Staff who once ignored her now addressed her properly. Others, newer to the firm, met her as she was now, the visible architect of reform. The days after Barrett's departure unfolded with a surprising stillness, not the absence of activity, but the absence of shadow. The once unspoken hierarchy that had ruled Carrington and Rowe from the inside out had begun to dissolve, not through upheaval, but through a quiet reordering. Meetings became more candid. Internal communication adopted clearer language. Department heads who once smiled past inconvenient truths now asked real questions, requested verification, and opened their processes to review. The firm, though still imperfect, began to reflect something closer to what it always claimed to be, a place where work, not politics, guided progress. Yet amid that change, there was one name that went unspoken, one face that had vanished not just from the directory, but from the rhythm of daily operations. Barrett Langford. For nearly a month after his resignation, no one knew where he had gone. Rumors floated through the office, Europe, retirement, consulting under a different banner. None of it mattered. What mattered was what had remained in his wake, a legacy bruised by exposure, not ruined by anger, but by its own design. And still, Ramona moved forward. She chaired each committee review with the same quiet authority. She responded to inquiries with data, corrected misinformation without hostility, and continued to shape policies with a steady, impartial hand. She never mentioned Barrett again, but the wound he had created, the system that had upheld him, was being dissected piece by piece through the very tools he had once used to control others. And then, one morning, nearly 6 weeks since the vote that had ended his tenure, Ramona received a message. It arrived through the internal compliance channel, an encrypted appointment request tagged as former executive request, private meeting. She read it twice, noting the timestamp, the digital signature. It was from Barrett. No assistant, no third party, no subject line beyond the identifier. She sat with it for several minutes before opening her calendar and assigning a time, Thursday, for p.m., in one of the unused side conference rooms on the 32nd floor. She sent the confirmation without a note. She marked it as closed door and excluded it from her public agenda. At exactly 4, the door opened. Barrett entered slowly, no briefcase, no papers, just a plain navy suit and a look in his eyes that was not diminished, but different. His posture was looser, his movements less rehearsed. He sat without asking, and for a moment neither spoke. Ramona did not smile. She simply waited. He began without preamble. He acknowledged everything, not just the missteps, not just the audit trail of the financial breaches, but the core of it. He named the prejudice. He didn't soften the words. He said he had operated for years under the illusion that leadership had a shape, a sound, a history, and that she had challenged that without defiance, without rage, and in doing so, revealed how hollow his foundation really was. He admitted that he had been afraid, not of her, but of what she represented. A kind of competence that didn't ask permission. A a kind of excellence that didn't rely on performance. He said he had mistaken her silence for submission, her stillness for invisibility. And now, after everything, he had realized that the very thing he tried to erase had become the firm's most honest mirror. Ramona listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't forgive. When he finished, she asked a single question. Why now? His answer was simple. Because I've finally heard myself clearly, and it's unbearable. She nodded. The silence returned, not heavy, but clean. When he left the room, he didn't shake her hand. He didn't ask for anything. He left the space as he had entered it, quietly, directly, without spectacle. The next day, a message went out to the firm announcing a voluntary address by former CEO Barrett Langford. It would take place in the Central Forum, open to all staff, with the express purpose of sharing personal reflections on leadership, integrity, and the future of the firm. No one knew what to expect. Many were skeptical. Some chose not to attend. But when the hour came, the room filled beyond capacity. Ramona sat near the back, out of the spotlight. Barrett stepped onto the stage and began to speak. He did not tell stories. He did not offer excuses. He spoke about blindness, not of sight, but of certainty. He described how systems built to reward the familiar will always punish what they do not understand. He admitted that his leadership had protected comfort at the expense of truth. He explained how power, when insulated from accountability, does not preserve legacy, it distorts it. And then, looking directly toward the back of the room, he named Ramona Ellis. He spoke her name with clarity and weight. He said she had taught him the cost of erasure, not through confrontation, but through persistence. That she had not just survived the culture he had shaped, she had remade it. That her presence, once ignored, now defined the firm's direction. He asked the firm not to follow her out of guilt or obligation, but because she represented what they claimed to be. And it was time their actions matched their ideals. He left the stage to a silence more profound than applause. No one stood, no one clapped, but every person in the room knew something had ended, and something else had begun. Later that day, Barrett exited the building for the last time, not escorted, not shamed, but as a man who had finally stopped hiding from what he had been and what he had done. His redemption was not complete. It never could be, but his recognition was. In the weeks that followed, the firm continued to evolve. Policies shifted. Reporting structures aligned more closely with ethical standards. New hires reflected a broader spectrum of backgrounds and voices. Ramona remained steady, focused not on legacy, but on structure. She did not become a figurehead. She became a standard, not through charisma, but through clarity. People no longer looked past her. They looked to her. One evening, months later, as she stood alone in her office overlooking the city, she removed from her drawer the old event lanyard labeled event staff and placed it beside the new firm charter, which bore her name on the final page as its principal author. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply looked at them both, side by side, one a symbol of dismissal, the other a symbol of structure. And in that stillness, she understood that the true measure of justice is not found in punishment, but in the correction of imbalance. Not in public applause, but in structural change. And when prejudice is dismantled not by noise, but by truth that cannot be denied, then the silence that once oppressed becomes the quiet in which real progress is built. The end. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading. If you found the story powerful or thought-provoking, consider giving it a like and subscribing so you don't miss future releases. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot twists and character journey? Did any moments stand out to you personally? Also, let me know where you're watching or reading from in the comments. It's always great to see where these stories are connecting with people. Drop your reactions below. I read every one.